have a first question for you. And Mr. Almond, you've traveled quite a bit to be here today. Tell me a little bit about where you've been this week.
This week, I'm thinking what day it is.
Today is Thursday.
Today is Thursday.
We're recording this on a
Yeah,
Thursday
we're
morning.
in Milwaukee recording.
In Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Yeah, we have a weird life as musicians in that our schedules often don't line up with things like holidays or weekend nights sometimes. So I do a lot of stuff away from the MSO as well as a lot of stuff in the city here. Some of it's solo dates, some of it's chamber music, some of it's just to get away, sometimes, or take care of other things. So I didn't really have a Memorial Day because we were working through the weekend, and then I realized I had a couple days off. And then another recording had just come out, and these guys at Sirius XM, am I allowed to say that on the
Sure. Sirius XM.
These guys at Sirius XM got interested in it, and they have a program that they wanted to do on Symphony Hall at Sirius that they wanted to do a short interview for. And I was going to go to New York to take care of a few things anyway. I lived there for 15 years, and when I escape, sometimes I just go there. So I was there and did that and saw some friends in the Philharmonic and saw a concert and hooked up with a couple of old colleagues, and that was really fun.
For sure.
For 2 days of frantic New York activity.
Mm-hmm.
And then came back yesterday and rehearsed with some MISO kids in the afternoon for a concert that we have tonight. So, it's great, but it's a little frenetic sometimes.
For sure.
Although we're going into the summer now, and I have a little bit quieter summer, so that's
Nice. Well, thank you for fitting this into your schedule.
Yeah.
And so you're listening to the MKE Arts Live podcast. My name is Adam Carr, the host of the show. I'm joined by Frank Almond, a man of many descriptions. You're a concert master. You're an incredible musician, violinist. I'm sure you could keep going on. What other things do you like to include?
Mostly positive things.
Right.
I've been described in lots of different ways.
A scallywag?
Yeah, no. Well, I run a chamber music series here. I teach. I have a position with the Milwaukee Youth Symphony that it's very satisfying and gratifying. I really love working with them. And I just try to do a lot of community stuff mixed in with, playing around lots of different kinds of, mostly classical activities.
For sure. So in the episode of MKE Arts Live that you will be a part of, and this is sort of our precursor interview for, is about stories from the stage, and you just happen to have not only one of the best or most kind of unlikely stories in this canon of stories in Milwaukee, but probably in the whole world, one of the most ridiculous and absurd stories you happen to be one of the main characters of, and it is that of the Stradivarius violin that you play being stolen from you and eventually returned and all that goes with it. And I actually just want to ask first, how tired are you of talking about this? Does it feel like a curse?
No. It's fine now. For about 2 years, it's about all anybody wanted to talk about.
Sure.
I got used to it, and it's okay. It's an amazing saga that I still can't quite get my head around. So I understand why people want to talk about it. At first, maybe it was more difficult. And also in the first few months, it probably took me 6 or 7 months to get most of the information about the case. And even longer, actually, now that I think about it, because there was still some detectives and people I became friends with that told me things like a year later that I'd never even known.
Sure.
Because while the whole thing was going on, I actually stayed fairly detached intentionally from the investigation and from the press, because in my experience, the more that you talk during those things, the more it can screw it up.
For sure.
as one of the perpetrators, I think, really proved.
Right.
to his detriment.
Well, so for me, even something that I've read some of the stuff that's out there about it. There's more out there than I could digest, but something I think is lost in it, or at least in some of the accounts, is that it kind of has a sort of comical spin to it. Like there's the absurdity of the situation, but also, part of it, just getting a chance to talk to you about it, is you got seriously injured in the middle in the one of the
forgets that,
right. And like for me, getting tased, or as it has been in the news recently, is no laughing matter, really.
No.
But there's sort of a lot of laughter around that part of it. So I can imagine the actual sort of trauma that you experienced in the middle of it, that kind of gets buried sometimes.
Maybe. I mean, it gets lost, I think, in certain ways because it was only one element of a multifaceted set of events that happened just the night of the theft itself.
Mm-hmm.
Getting shot with a taser is no fun. I can just assure any of your listeners.
Yeah.
If you can possibly avoid it, just don't get shot with a taser. But in my case, it was even more bizarre for two reasons. One is that I talked to a lot of police officers. I don't think one of them had ever heard about an armed robbery where a taser had been used. Mm. That was one of the things early on that I think really raised a lot of questions. They were like, why would this guy use a taser? And I was like, well, I'm happy he used a taser rather than something else. But the second thing is that you kind of have to be, in order for it to be really effective, you sort of have to be trained to use a taser.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly he was not. It was probably a lucky shot in a certain way.
Sure.
But I think because of that, I was down on the ground for maybe less time than I would have had he used it properly.
Right. You got kind of the half of the full, or less than half. I think
I got the full thing, but not to get into the details of how a taser works, but it completes a circuit and you go down quickly. And generally you're down for a minute or two. It's very effective.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, I think one of the little taser barbs, one of them was stuck in my wrist and one of them was stuck in a really thin slit kind of jacket I was wearing.
Mm-hmm.
It was also 9 below zero that night. And I think the second one popped out or something. So it completed it enough to immobilize me.
Sure.
But also, I was so hopped up and I knew immediately what had happened, that your adrenaline kicks in, and I was just insane. And I just got up probably within 15 or 20 seconds.
Sure.
And in time enough to watch this crazy van drive away, and I knew the violin was inside of it.
Can I ask you another question at this point? This is sort of, I'm sure you've run, we're going to then move to more of sort of a chronological run through this, but something I was thinking about. So this is speculation. He used a taser, which immobilized you, and it happened in pretty short order in the actual heist that he pulled. Have you thought about if he had a handgun, for example?
Of course.
What would you have done? I mean, you're holding something that's like about $6 million, and for me, I've been mugged before, and I gave my wallet. I'll just give you my wallet if you're threatening my life. Have you kind of figured through your own calculation of the hypothetical, what you would have done in that case?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I couldn't see anything. It was really dark, so I couldn't even see the taser until you see these little flashing lights, and it was inside of his coat. So my guess is that if he had flashed a handgun or something, I would have just,
acquiesced,
done what I needed to do and given. Yeah, I'm not that stupid.
Mm-hmm.
But he still would have had the problem of stealing a Stradivarius,
right?
And maybe I would have survived, maybe not. But I'm glad he didn't use something stronger than a taser.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like the idea of the instrument being stolen had never occurred to me.
Right.
I knew a lot about instrument thefts and actually researched it quite a bit because I've had these instruments since I was a teenager. And one good thing is that they're never intentionally stolen, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can think of 2 or 3 cases where they've been stolen and haven't been recovered, but not intentionally.
Sure.
You know, people leave them on buses. They leave them in a train. They leave them in the trunk of their car like Yo-Yo did once with his cello. They're accidentally stolen.
Sure.
And then the person that steals it has a big problem because
Right.
usually they just think they're stealing a guitar or something, or
Right,
something
right.
they can pawn, and suddenly the whole world's looking for them.
Yeah.
So that's if they're ever stolen, that's really how it happens. That's what was so bizarre about this, because it turned out that it had been planned so meticulously,
Mm-hmm.
and it was actually there was a real stalking element to
Right.
it that I didn't find out about until many, many months later. But that was kind of creepy.
That's why I'm glad I get to talk to you about it, because having read it, there's sort of like a glibness that everyone talks about it with.
Yeah.
And for you, like you were stalked. I mean, and there were these different layers of the creepiness of it, but then also the violence of it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start in, let's just pick up this story in 2008.
Yeah.
That's when you get notified that there might be a violin.
Right. I got an email out of the blue that it was actually kind of an estate situation.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just an email that said, we have this Stradivari instrument from 1715. It's called the Lipinski, and it's part of an estate situation, et cetera, et cetera. And they were looking essentially for information about options, what to do with it. It wasn't like, hey, do you want to play this thing?
Mm-hmm.
And I was really curious about it because I get these emails once in a while, or even letters now from
Right.
the person that has a Stradivari in their attic or whatever, a couple times a year, and it's never really pans out.
Sure.
This one was different because it had some really interesting details in the email, and I knew enough about the history of this instrument that it lined up. And so I still wasn't sure, but we got in touch and hit it off, and it kind of went from there over the next several months. It wasn't right away, but they were looking for advice, really. This is what happens when you sell it. This is what happens when you keep it.
Sure.
This is what happens when you loan it out to somebody like me. But they came to the decision, and I think this is something that was, speaks a lot about the owners. They really wanted it to be connected to the community of Milwaukee, where they still have roots. These are not, big donor types to the arts or anything. They just had a connection here, and they thought, okay, what if you played it and people could see it and hear it all the time, and you could take care of it? I'd had these instruments before, and there was an element of trust, and we'd become quite good friends, and still are, actually.
So I am not a preeminent violin player.
Mm-hmm.
That's not part of my life.
Is that what you do?
That's not what I do. I'm not known for that. But so I suspect in the small class of people that you are of which there are probably, a few dozen of around distributed throughout the globe, there must be, like, you must know, there must be a thought of maybe someday a Stradivarius will be part of my life.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And do you hope for that? You kind of think like, hopefully it will fall from the sky and I'll be there to catch it when it happens.
Weird. I've had really good instrument karma almost my entire life. I don't know why, but it was just, I did not come from a background where we could buy one of these things or anything close. And growing up in Southern California, I remember the first really great instrument I played on. I was probably 12 or 13 years old. There was a famous collection of instruments in Los Angeles, and they loaned them out to young musicians. And it totally changed everything, because you realize that essentially it's a kind of a high-end tool to help you do what you do and maximize what you can do. So once you get a taste of that, and you're no longer kind of driving around in the Ford Pinto, and somebody maybe gives you a really nice car to drive.
Sure.
then you have to give it back, of course, at some point, and hopefully somebody loans you another one. So by the time I got to Juilliard, they had a really nice collection of instruments, and I was able to regularly borrow one. There was another guy who helped me a lot, who had a collection of instruments, and so this was like the third Strad that I had had for a fair amount of time. And every time I got one, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe this thing's, in my apartment or my house or whatever. I mean, I had a real appreciation. I knew what it was, right? And my biggest fear was to do something thoughtless, like, you have it become such part of your routine that, you leave it in a parking lot or whatever.
Right.
While you're packing.
You get too used to it.
You get too used to it, yeah. And that's why when I hear these stories of people leaving it on a train because they were getting their suitcase out or whatever, it's not all that surprising. It's sort of the equivalent of leaving your coffee cup on top of your car, in a way. So anyway, back to your original question. Yeah, every guitarist wants to have 20 minutes with a 58 Gibson Les Paul, okay? And I don't know one violinist that would not love to play on a 1715 Strad for any amount of time. Although you do have to learn how to play them.
Right.
Both of those examples, actually. And it's not like you give somebody, another, I think, myth is that you give somebody a Strad and they're just going to sound unbelievable. That's not how it works.
Well, as I hadn't really, it hadn't occurred to me that it's almost like an episode of it's almost like a episode of The Twilight Zone, where it's like this thing that you get amplifies your strengths and your weaknesses. Like it's like.
Yeah, I think if you are thoughtful about it and spend and look at the options and are open to the options, that's right. They're these mysterious things where they're functional antiquities. There's really, people talk about what's the big deal about a Stradivarius or these old instruments? Why are they worth so much money? Why is all blah, blah, blah? And there's a lot of levels to it. Again, one of them is that you spend a couple months with these things as a musician, as a player, and you realize that your whole way of playing adapts to the instrument, and the instrument in a really strange way kind of adapts to you. Like, I've played on high-end instruments that somebody else has had for 8 or 9 years, and it really would take me several days to kind of get used to how their instrument was set up, and it's almost like it's used to somebody else playing it.
Sure. And
you factor in also with somebody like Stradivari that they're essentially perfect. Aesthetically, they are beautiful to look at. They're perfectly engineered with the absolute highest quality materials. And by engineering, I mean Stradivari really revolutionized the way people made those instruments. The biggest example is that he elongated the body of the instrument and he kind of flattened out the arch on the instrument itself. Whereas before that, 50 years earlier, they were making these little puffy Baroque instruments that were pretty, but didn't sound anywhere near as powerful and were not as easy to play. And so Stradivari had this vision, and at the apex of his powers, really revolutionized the instrument on every level possible. Plus, by that time, he was so wealthy that because he was making such a superior product. It's funny. It's like I'm talking about like cars or something, making. But he did have basically a sort of miniature assembly line. People think of this old guy carving stuff, but he probably had 2 or 3 people working for him most of the time. Had access to the best possible materials because he was so wealthy. I mean, he put a lot of people out of business, and of course, there's a finite number of them. They're not making them anymore. So you factor all that together. Now, what else do you know that's 300 years old that is the best of the best and is functional? It's not like a painting you hang on the wall.
Sure.
It's different with everybody, and it's you can still use them. Now, there's the argument also that they should be preserved in a museum, so they don't get stolen, for example, or damaged.
Yeah.
You know, but I obviously subscribe to the former. I'd rather.
Sure.
I think they're for players, and that's what they're meant.
Can you talk? It's something you mentioned about when you came into possession of this Stradivarius, the Lipinski, is that the owners of it wanted to keep it connected to Milwaukee.
Yeah.
Which probably is unique from my knowledge, being a layman on this. Like, there probably aren't a lot of folks who own a Stradivarius that are saying we want this to be attached to a community in some way.
Well, I think it depends on the community and the mindset of the owners.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked with a lot of people that own these high-end instruments. Some of them it's a huge ego thing and they're just toys.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them it's just investments, because if you know what you're doing, they are great investments. Some of them it's a tax dodge where they donate it to a certain institution, like the Philadelphia Orchestra or whatever. And then the orchestra member can use it. Or several orchestras around the country have small collections of instruments, usually not on this level. And I think it was a kind of altruistic way of helping the community. It's not really tied to the orchestra, but they also, I think, liked that I was doing a number of different kinds of activities, so that MISO kids can hear it, so that when the MSO goes and plays outside of the hall, other people can hear it. And then, of course, the subscriptions that we do downtown. You know, it's a part of the fabric of the community, which is another reason that it played so strongly into this story when it was taken. A lot of people took it personally.
and even the fella who took it in some ways seemed to have a conception of the violin belonging in Milwaukee in some respects.
That is mystifying to me.
Yeah.
Because, it's this weird dichotomy, you know? He clearly had a respect for what the object was. And through his 3 or 4 years of research as he planned this theft, I know it's amazing, but that's apparently how long he spent on it. He obviously had a knowledge of art, and in a kind of twisted way saw himself as kind of a high-end art thief, like he's rappelling down, stealing paintings or something, you know, like Thomas Crown. And in reality, he would have been much better off just taking my wallet. You know, I mean, it's ridiculous, but he I think really saw himself that way.
So I don't know how to pronounce his name.
Well,
Saladin.
Saladin. Yeah. Also, he's got a couple of aliases, but his real name is Saladin.
Saladin. I just want to give for our listener, if you haven't engaged with this story, it's far too big for us to discuss in full here comprehensively, but I'll give a little bit of background on what I think is some of the essential stuff to know about him. So he's the guy that took the violin. He's in his early 40s when he perpetrated the crime. He has 5 kids. He'd previously stolen a sculpture from a gallery in Milwaukee and then tried to return it to the gallery. Or it's alleged that he stole it, but he did try to return it to the gallery from which it had been taken about 15 years prior to the stealing of the Strad, which gives you a sense of this. Like, he might have stolen it from a place and then tried to bring it back for the insurance, which is, you know, not a great plan.
No, it's not.
And he, so he, like you said, he lives in Milwaukee, but he also sort of fathoms himself as a high-end art thief.
Well, he lives in a federal prison right now.
That's true.
Yes.
He's from Milwaukee.
Yeah, he lived in Milwaukee. Yeah.
And there aren't probably a lot of folks in Milwaukee who engage in crime on occasion who conceive of themselves in this way, of this sort of like this magnitude of I'm a high-end art thief. But like you said, he'd done some of the requisite research into getting towards that title. But and I think he got to know the pattern of your life in ways that were, like you've already mentioned, is sort of profoundly unsettling and creepy. And what I found interesting is when, he did some ill-advised interviews. So sort of post being arrested and everything, he wanted to defend his name. So he called some folks and shared some information. And what I saw that I wouldn't have expected is that he spoke of you in pretty high regard. Like he respected you. At least he said that he respected you. Maybe he didn't behave in a respectful way towards you as a musician, as, someone who is a proper steward of this instrument that he ended up taking from you. So he actually spoke of you in high regard. So how do you kind of conceive of this guy, sort of your foil in this story?
Well, he said a lot of things. I'll point that out.
Yeah.
I think in many ways you could only come to the conclusion that there's a certain amount of delusion going on here. And the interviews that he gave, not just after he was arrested, but also while he was out on bail, he talked incessantly, which was great for us in the end. But he had all kinds of different stories about what this was about. From an Asian gang that he claimed put him up to it, to he had nothing to do with it, to, But in the end, I think he was just a guy who had a respect for, maybe some kind of twisted respect for what I do and what the instrument is and its place in the city. But that wasn't going to prevent him from carrying out what he thought was the ultimate art heist. And I think this actually, from what I understand, the genesis of this happened while he was in prison. He did mention it to some of his friends that his ultimate crime would be to steal a Stradivarius. And when he was arrested, there was all kinds of evidence they found in his apartment that, he had done all this kinds of research. And one of my favorite things they found was a handwritten book on, apparently a handwritten book on how to steal Stradivarius.
Whoa. Did he write it?
Apparently it's in a little notebook he had.
Oh, wow.
Found it. Yeah, maybe there were little pictures or, I never saw it, but one of the law enforcement guys told me that it was one of the more bizarre things they found. But he also had articles from when the violin first turned up. He had books on Stradivari. I mean, it was not a well-concealed thing.
Sure.
So, anyway, I think the sculpture incident was telling of what his thinking was. My understanding is that he returned it. It was stolen, and he somehow came in possession of it at the gallery where he used to work, and took it back there, and was promptly arrested.
Yeah.
So, that I just think says a lot about how he was thinking.
Not a great criminal.
Well, he's smart enough to steal it.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's not so hard to steal them. Crimes like this happen in two phases.
Right.
You can steal it, but then you have
what
to
do you
figure
do
out
with it?
What to do with it. And that, to this day, I think is what is so mystifying to everybody. One of the many mystifying aspects of this case. Nobody knew what he was thinking.
He didn't seem to have a plan after he got out of the parking garage.
I don't think those guys. There was, also another person involved, his friend who bought the taser for him a year earlier. Saladin had 2 felony convictions against him before this, as he was planning this. One, I think, was the sculpture incident, I think. So he wasn't able to buy a taser. He got a friend of his to buy the taser in his own name with his own credit card, and had it sent to his own address, which became quite helpful to law enforcement. Yeah.
So let's get to the evening that it happened on. So I'll walk through some of the details. It's January 27th, 2014. Very, very cold day. You go up to the west side of Milwaukee, kind of Tosa area, in the evening to play a concert with your chamber group.
Yeah.
at Wisconsin Lutheran.
Right. Yeah.
So normal, pretty much, right? Happens. Normal concert for you.
Yeah, it's this series I've done for a long time, and we have part of it's out there. You know, very intense program, and went a little bit later than normal. You know, it's just a longer program, but yeah. So a bunch of us walked out of the stage door, and there's this kind of urban myth that I was just walking around by myself, and 4 or 5 of us at least walked out that door, and I had been really happy to get a parking place right next to the stage door because it was so cold.
Yeah. Why were you dressed so lightly? That was something I saw.
Yeah, because my car was right there. I didn't have to.
Did you have a heavier jacket in the car that you just didn't?
No, I didn't need it because all I was going to do was run from the car. I
feel kind of motherly right now. Like, Frank, you should
wear a coat.
Wear your parka.
Wear a coat.
Come on.
But there's a practical side to it because I don't want the violin outside in that amount in that kind of weather for very long. It's not good for it. So I'm always thinking that way. If it's 7 below, get close to the door, okay? So it was outside for maybe 10 seconds, and then you put it in the car, and the car warms up, you know? I mean, and the same thing with me. I didn't need a big puffy jacket or, you know, it's just a pain. So as I'm walking to my car, there's this van backed in, and it was running. And it wasn't there before the concert, and this was not a high-quality vehicle, okay? I mean, think like Scooby-Doo van, like more in that direction.
Like a beat-up old minivan.
Yeah, something like that. And I noticed it, of course, because it was running, and I thought, I mean, we'd had a reception there, but I thought maybe they're just picking somebody up, and so I won't get into the weeds of how things were actually laid out, but I walked around and Saladin walked around the other sides where I couldn't really see him, and before I could get the violin, and the violin was over my shoulder, and before I could get it in the back seat where it has this little seat belt and everything, I couldn't get it off my shoulder, and he kept getting closer and closer and closer. And he didn't say anything, and he had on. It was hard to see too because he actually did have on a giant parka with a hood, and there were these little flashing lights. And I remember thinking, why is that guy taking my picture? You know. And then I just went down. And
was there pain? Did you?
Yeah, it was awful.
Yeah, I mean, like really sharp.
50,000 volts will get your attention.
Right.
You know,
like you didn't just like pass out.
No, you shake a lot, and it's like being electrocuted really badly.
I mean, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, you are being electrocuted.
Yeah.
Right. But it's also designed to just immobilize your muscles, and so and like I said, I knew exactly what had happened and got up and was kind of running in circles. And they had not taken my phone, which I was happy about. And it turned out that one of the other guys who was on the concert was still in the parking lot. And the van drove right in front of him.
That's Todd.
That was Todd leaving,
okay.
Yeah, who still plays as our incredible principal clarinet here. And we're very close friends.
So the minivan drives off. You were immobilized long enough that it gets away, kind of, and then you get up and you're sort of in a panic.
Yeah, I'd say I was about as hysterical as I've ever been about anything. And we had the sense to call 911 right away, and then this chain of events happened that was, looking back on it, I mean, it's kind of funny because you're describing to a dispatcher. First of all, they couldn't really find us because the layout there is a parking lot, but it's not really where the entrance is. And
so right, so you have to give them a very specific coordinate that defies any logical description.
And then I'm telling him, like, I heard actually recently a tape of the 911 call, and I don't remember sounding like that, so I apologize if anybody hears it. But you're trying to explain to them, you know, yes, it's Stradivarius. It's worth millions of dollars, and it was just stolen on the West Side. Please, someone send someone out, please, like now.
Right.
Because I also knew enough about it. There's a time factor.
Right.
I knew how I would have stolen it, and you don't hang around with it for very long. So we had to call him twice, actually, because 15 minutes went by, and finally this sort of lonely squad car drove into the parking lot, and it was a couple of very nice MPD squad beat cops basically doing their job. So tell me what happened, that kind of thing. And I'm in the back of a squad car trying to explain to these guys what had happened with a couple of taser barbs sticking out of me.
Sure.
So, I mean, I had that going. They believed me, I think, to a certain degree, but
it
literally was like, what?
It's very confusing.
Yeah. But it's kind of, I mean, from their end, they must have thought I was completely insane.
Right.
It's worth how much, he actually did say, how do you spell Stradivari?
Yeah.
Why do you have that out here? And I'm like, look, guys, if we could just move this along, it might really help. And eventually I was calling people trying to get something going. Todd was still hanging around. He was calling people trying to get something going.
Yeah.
And then the really critical factor of Ed Flynn came into play, because it turned out that Chief Flynn at the time, he's retired now, but he was the police chief. He's a huge symphony fan. He went a lot, and I had met him a number of times, and we'd been out for drinks before. It wasn't like we're best friends, but I knew he would get it, like right away. So you can imagine me, like, finally, I'm like, look, I don't know if there's any way that if you guys can just get to your police chief, but if you can get a line to him, please, you'll understand.
Yeah. And
of course, I got a predictable look, like, yeah, we'll get right on that.
Right. But they're like probably 6 steps away from him. Like they don't get audience with him.
Sure. Yeah, we're going to call the chief right away, and it's by this time it's an hour and a half in, and it's just before midnight or whatever. But Todd did finally found some way to get to him. And I remember I was talking to another police officer that had shown up on the scene, and they were all incredibly professional and nice, but they were just trying to do their jobs. And somebody handed him a cell phone, and it was Chief Flynn.
That's fast.
Well, an hour and a half in.
Sort of
it
fast.
Was fast enough.
Right.
And he talked to the officers in the scene, and then they handed me the cell phone, and he talked to me for a little while. Was very reassuring and did what I thought he would do. But still, it's shocking. I mean, he threw everything at it. And literally within about 10 minutes, there must have been 6 or 7, 8 cars showed up, forensics guys and an ambulance that I didn't want.
Yeah.
And it just all lit up. And it was a serious thing with a lot of guys scratching their heads going, what are we doing out here?
So, and I think, I'm sure the police are very governed by protocol, and there's codes for things or how to respond. And this sounded like an all hands on deck.
Totally.
But without, normally they'll say, okay, why? And then they'll say, here's why, and everyone will get it. And this is like an art heist.
Yeah. And I have to say, whatever, Chief Flynn was justifiably controversial to a lot of people. But in this case, I think if you think about it, it took a lot of courage to do that. There were no dead bodies, and he pulled some of the best homicide detectives immediately into this. He put the best Metro detectives on this case, and he said, this is all in, To him, this was like the crime of the century, next to maybe the Jeffrey Dahmer case. And he understood the magnitude of what would happen if this thing disappeared and what it would mean for the city of Milwaukee, probably for years to come. I don't think he understood the cultural significance, but also he was thinking about the reputation, the legacy of the city. It was just a big deal to him. So I think he took a lot of heat for it, especially over the next couple of days with people wondering why they were doing this. But then, gradually, I think people understood it.
I mean, the calculus on the part of the police, and I think I have gained an appreciation for this, which is that anything they do, they're not doing everything else, right? Like if you send police to do if you send police to do community policing, so like meeting people, talking with people, building relationships, if you have beat cops doing that, they're not patrolling. They're not responding to
Yes.
you know, the potential homicide or whatever it is within a community that is rightfully an urgent situation. So that is something that I think is very complex about this. His response, how he used police resources. I mean, right. So like the instrument itself is extremely valuable. It's symbolic in a lot of ways. And it seemed like I saw a quote from him that like this was Milwaukee's little piece of the Western heritage, which I actually think is kind of a weird thing to say, but like to me personally, and he said we had just been challenged, it had just been stolen, and we were bloody well going to find it. And I think, you know, so he took it in a way like personally of like, you know, they literally deal with hundreds, thousands of crimes in the daily course of what they do. And this was one that just set off he'd probably never thought of it before.
Maybe not.
But
nobody did.
Right.
I mean, you know, the next morning there were a couple of FBI art crimes guys here.
Right.
Nobody had ever heard of anything like this. He also grasped that and understood that the next day the fallout from this in the press was going to be big.
Right.
And it was. There were guys on my lawn.
Right.
And virtually every news organization in the world was contacting not just me, but him also.
Right.
Then he pulls all these homicide detectives off of other cases. It's not true that there were trials postponed or anything. Everything went on the way it was supposed to do. It was supposed to proceed. But even those detectives, I think, were wondering what this was. They became fascinated with the case, ironically. But for a while, my understanding is that there were, 20 or 30 detectives working on this for a couple of days. And that's one of the reasons I think it was solved so quickly. Also, the FBI figured out very quickly, for reasons that I won't go into, that they did not believe this was some conspiracy or professional job at all.
Sure. I think, that we can kind of summarize that. Spoiler alert, about a week later on February. So the violin was taken from you on the night of the 27th, January 27th, 2014. February 3rd of 2014 is when Saladin was arrested. And so that's about a week. And I guess the summary of that, you can go out and read a lot more about it, is that he should have been a lot more tight-lipped. He didn't cover himself very well. He sort of... there was too much information out there about the fact that he might be doing this, and they found the line back to him eventually.
Yeah, and it didn't take him very long. I found out later on that taser had a lot to do with it.
Right.
Just because of the evidence that a taser can leave behind. That was very simple for them to put together. But again, like buying it in your own credit card and things like that.
Right. It has, what I saw, the term that people use is there was essentially confetti with the serial number on it.
Yeah, a lot of identifying information that could trace it back to who bought it and when and how. And it went right to Saladin.
So Saladin's...
Plus he was talking all the time.
Right. So he's kind of bragging about it. And then his associates are kind of telling people about it because it's this big deal thing. And
yeah, and a lot... He also... It was interesting because there are two things that I'd like to bring up. He didn't get a lot of sympathy from very many people. And the second thing is that, I mean, in any socioeconomic class in this city, I don't think there were people lining up to defend what this guy did. Okay. Secondly, I was really cognizant, and I think so was Chief Flynn, of a possible racial element to this crime developing. And I never saw it that way. I was deeply offended by that idea if it was floated. I don't think it was part of the equation. And I was really happy that it never really turned into that, which is unusual when you think of what often has happened in this city. This could have easily spun out of control, into this high-end elitist kind of artsy thing being stolen, and a racial angle on it. And because of the way I think that the orchestra handled it publicly, and because of the way that law enforcement handled it publicly, that was just never even part of the discussion. I was really grateful for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to emphasize that.
And I mean, something that is I have Saladin sounds like he had a pretty hard life. I mean,
yeah, from what I understand, yeah.
And that obviously doesn't excuse or exonerate him of what he did, but he did have, you know, he always kind of struggled.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like in his life, and I thought something about what he actually did with the violin is he ended up taking it out of the case and putting it in a suitcase of his own.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought this was sort of like touching to me in a way, but not like what he said is that he wrapped it in the blanket that he brought one of his children home from the hospital in.
Mm-hmm.
Just like a really, I mean, this whole thing is stranger than fiction, but that in a weird way, like it brought me to a place of feeling like, I mean, he said so many things, but that was like,
if it's true, yeah,
right. I'm like, oh, that's kind of sweet in a way, maybe. I don't know.
Well, let me just cut to the chase here.
Yeah.
When they found the violin, part of the plea bargain that he ended up with was that the violin had to be returned in good condition.
Mm-hmm.
Our biggest concern, the violin and the bows, by the way, he took two extremely expensive violin bows, and that actually probably bothered me as much as the violin itself, because bows are valuable. One of these I'd had since I was in school. Mm-hmm. And they're highly individual. People spend their whole, nobody knows this, this is really wonky stuff, but mm-hmm. people spend their whole lives trying to find a bow that feels right, that works with a certain instrument. And he took both of them, and it signified to me that this was a person that understood the value of those as well. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the plea bargain stipulated that the violin needed to be returned in good condition, not kindling. And we were terrified that it would be damaged beyond repair. So when it was found, when he finally led them after this goose chase that was a whole other thing. The night that they found the instrument, I found out later on that he drove them around the city for hours. He knew where it was, but it was just,
leading him on.
Pathological kind of like stuff I can't understand.
Yeah. He liked the attention.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what it is. He was, sociopath in a certain way.
Yeah. Probably felt really good for him. Like some of the things,
right, yeah.
Like he pulled something off. Like,
yeah, until he didn't.
Right. Well, yeah, there was, like you mentioned before, there's two parts to it. He pulled the first part off, and that's something that is forever notorious. Mm-hmm. And then the second part he had no plan for.
Which is also like, what?
Which ruins his life.
Right.
in every other way.
You forgot about that other step. So they find the violin, and it was indeed wrapped in a baby blanket. It was in an attic in a house, in an abandoned house on the south side that was unheated, and the door was unlocked.
Yeah.
There was nobody in there. SWAT team guys or whoever, somebody from, I think it was the FBI art crimes guy, actually went up into the attic. They searched the whole house. They couldn't find it. He wouldn't tell them where it was. And finally, I think they went into the attic, and there's this blue vinyl suitcase, and it was, in fact, wrapped inside a blanket. And the bows were in there. There were some other weird personal items thrown in, and his driver's license.
Right. Which is, I mean, it's his calling card.
Yeah, that when I heard that, I was like, well, I don't know what to say to that.
Well, I mean, the other stuff, like he had sort of planned to escape, like it was stuff that was like a to-go bag or whatever. But then he didn't go and.
Well, if you're somebody who's just stolen something like that, and I don't know, he left his driver's license
right
in the suitcase. Okay, that's just about all you have to say.
Yeah, he did a very bad job.
Yeah. Mm.
So they find it, and I'm sure stunned. It's in decent shape, despite the fact being not in a good place. In the cold.
Now, I wasn't around for this, by the way.
Right.
I was out of town, and so I was relying on other people to sort of report to me what had happened. And I spoke with Chief Flynn, and I spoke with a couple of other people who assured me that it actually seemed like it was in good condition. But it was bizarre because I'd gotten sick of the whole thing and decided to go play these concerts in Florida. And, you know, we were sort of forlorn after one of these concerts and sitting in this stupid strip mall bar. I know, it's insane.
Yeah.
And it was like,
it's like humid.
The three of us.
Yeah.
It's a strip mall bar in Florida with everything you can imagine, like the classic dartboard and pool tables and a couple of alcoholics and us. And it's like midnight, and my phone is ringing, and I finally answered it, and it was Chief Flynn, and I stood out in this parking lot in Florida. He's like, "We found the violin," and I remember saying, "You got to be kidding me!"
Yeah,
you know. And then I said, "How do you know it's the right violin?" Which was the first thing that occurred to me. Maybe he just gave him a dummy violin.
Yeah.
I said, "Well, you know, it looks like a Stradivarius to me," which actually made me laugh.
Yeah, that's funny.
But it turns out, you know, the art crimes guy had sort of certified it, and they sent me a couple pictures the next day, and it was there.
Do you remember the song that was playing in the bar? I just like to imagine it was like "Don't Stop Believing," or something like really too on the nose.
Probably was, but I don't remember that actually. I do remember going in and buying everybody a round of drinks,
and probably a shot. I hope as well.
Yes.
So you get how long between then and when you have it in your hands again?
We had a concert the next day in Florida that I had to play.
Mm-hmm.
So I spent the next day driving across the Panhandle in the back, or I was in the back seat, just dealing with phone calls. And they were having a press conference, and we were trying to work that out so that people couldn't get too close to I remember, you know, they wanted to have this big sort of display and show justifiably.
Yeah.
You know, it was a home run for these guys.
Right.
But there were practical things that we knew about. If they were taking pictures, if everybody, for example, could take pictures of the instrument super close up and it was damaged, then that affects the value of the instrument.
Sure.
So, you know, we came to some agreement where you can still see this picture online. There's a couple cops on each side of a table, and the press was sort of kept away a little bit, where you could get up close and personal, but not too up close.
Yeah. Those pictures are absurd to, like, when I saw it.
Yeah.
It like made me laugh out loud just because it's such a weird picture. Like,
I laughed too.
You couldn't orchestrate something that looked sillier, like not in a bad way. It's just a totally ridiculous set of circumstances.
Yeah. And on the front page of the New York Times, I remember seeing that thinking, wow, you know, this is just getting more bizarre, like, by the second. Anyway, back to your question.
Yep.
They couldn't get rid of the instrument fast enough. The police did not want to.
It's a lot of liability.
So some arrangements were made, and I was flying back the next morning. And I remember I drove directly from the airport to where the instrument was with the owners. I mean, the owners had the instrument. Actually, it was just one of them. And there was this kind of poignant moment, you know, where she and I just drove up, and she came out, and I think we, you know, had a couple of hugs, and she said, "Go in and take a look." So I went in and looked it over, and it was surprisingly good shape. A couple of bumps and bruises I could see. And I played a little bit, and we took a few pictures that I still have. And I got in the car and went home.
Right.
With it in my back seat. And I remember I went upstairs to my studio, and I started practicing, because it turned out that we had already planned this other concert that had been planned a year before. This was on a Friday, and the concert was Monday night. So
life goes on.
Life went on. And there was a real question whether to cancel that concert or not, because they were both out on bail at the time. And my life had become very complicated because of that. I didn't know these guys, and they were out running around. You know, I didn't know, were they going to show up at this concert? Were they watching my house? Were they?
Right. They've cased you pretty successfully at that point. So.
And I had sent my daughters to be somewhere else, and my wife, they had disappeared. You know, we were sort of advised. Nobody saw them as particularly retributive, you know, or violent. But you never know. So there's just weird things going on for the next few days, and then we played the concert, and I don't think I've ever seen so much law enforcement at a classical music concert.
Right.
It was crazy, but it was great in a way because it was kind of a homecoming, but it was scary in a way to be playing a concert with it. I could see an armed detective right off stage just in case something happened, and fortunately nothing did. Yeah.
So I don't want to take too much more time from you, but unfortunately I have like an hour more of stuff I'd want to talk about right now. So that was about 3 years ago or so. So it's far enough away that it's not super present, but you have some distance from it. And I'm kind of curious about the procedural stuff about like, I was thinking now when you played, like before, would people put in the agreement that you'd bring the Stradivarius to play? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, because you could show up with a different instrument, it might feel different. Do you know what I'm saying? They might be getting something different.
And sometimes
than what
people
they
might even not even know. No, it was never really part of the discussion. I mean, one of the things that happened, probably predictably, is that the story kind of overshadowed everything else for a while, and people started kind of advertising the violin almost more than the concert, and there were steps that we took to kind of try to minimize that now.
Right.
There's also, I don't always play on that instrument, and it gets moved around. There's some practical things that we had to do. But I'd say the bigger change is just more what happens in your kind of psychological approach to my musical and artistic life, because you can't help but change the way that you think about everything when you go through any kind of trauma like that.
Yep.
But if you're a musician and you're thoughtful, hopefully there's not just a deeper appreciation for what it is, but you dig a little bit deeper in so many different ways, and you play differently, and you find, or for me, it was about not just developing better focus and coping mechanisms, but also what the instrument was really capable of. I felt like that was kind of a signal, okay, now let's go. And do these projects, and what can you do with this instrument for other people? There's a kind of empathy that creeps into it as well.
It sounds like it kind of gave you a greater sense of not urgency necessarily, but of sort of the finality. I don't know.
Well, you live your life differently. I mean, I think if you're thoughtful and you really face it head on, you can't help but just think about things differently. And believe me, there have been worse things in my life since then. And the illness and the death of a spouse can't be compared to something like this.
Right.
And I've had to go through that as well, unfortunately. And strangely, I was able to utilize, this is another kind of bizarre silver lining, some of the things that came out of that whole violin saga played into the process over the last couple of years of just getting through that kind of grief. You can't compare the two, of course.
Sure.
But there are parallels. One's a loss that worked out with me getting the violin back, but she's not coming back, and I have to deal with it in a certain way, and those ways of thinking and just really facing things head on, like I mentioned, have become more and more a part of my life. So that's an odd turn, but that's another example, I think, of the things that can come out of this on a human level that actually are positive. As crazy as that whole saga was, it sent me in a different direction on so many levels in my life, not just artistically, but almost the way that you think about everything and what it means to be a person in this world right now, and especially if you have kids, and especially if you're an artist and you're trying to do something meaningful in a community that I really love. So those things take on a bit different kind of meaning. Yeah.
I think that's a very good place to end. I do have a lot more questions, but maybe some other time.
Sure.
Appreciate it,
multi-part.
Yeah, we could do the Almond saga.
Actually, the one thing I didn't mention, and I don't know if you want to insert this, there actually is a film coming. Mm-hmm. That was one of the first things that got talked about, instantly. But the last I heard, they're going to try and get this thing into Sundance in August. They've had a lot of big nibbles, and I saw the last trailer I saw is actually really good. It's a feature documentary, and you talk about getting to everybody. I mean, they got to everybody. Mm. They interviewed Sala a number of times, got to Flynn, they got to all the major players. So we could do a follow-up when that thing comes out, because it's going to get a lot of press.
Absolutely. So
it's called Plucked.
Plucked. That's a good one.
Which I thought was really
good. That's good. That's very good. Yeah. Plucked. I feel like it might be a case too, like the Tanya Harding thing or OJ, like where there's since been, in retrospect, now these not fictional, but like the not documentaries, the biopic kind of things.
Yeah, well, it's also the platforms are so different now.
Right.
Like, HBO has a whole documentary division, as does Netflix, as does Amazon. So, they've got a lot of opportunities here to get it out there, and I think they will. I think it's going to be really good.
Yeah. I look forward to seeing it. Well, thank you, Frank.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We'll talk again.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
We'll be on stage soon, right?
Yeah.
Over there.